They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west. Look at that thing, dude.
A close encounter spotted by a U.S. Air Force pilot off the coast of Jacksonville, Florida.
Oh my gosh, dude. Wow, look at that, man.
Shot in 2015, this video is among the growing number of UFO sightings in recent years. So much the U.S. military gave a classified briefing on Capitol Hill last week titled Threats to the Safety and Security of Our Aviators.
One of the key takeaways I'd have is that the military and others are taking this issue seriously, which I think in previous generations may not have been the case.
Even U.S. President Donald Trump weighed in.
I did have one very brief meeting on it, but people are saying they're seeing UFOs. Do I believe it? Not particularly.
The wheel is there to destroy the United States of America at the command of God. Why is God angry with America? It's because of you. Why did God destroy Pharaoh? He was angry with Pharaoh over Pharaoh's mistreatment of the children of Israel. Allah is angry over America's mistreatment of the black man and woman of America who are his people. And as I said 2 weeks ago, the children of Israel are not the so-called Jews.
Popular mythology tells us that Jewish slaves built the pyramids under the whips of the pharaoh. How well does this stand up to scrutiny? I'm Brian Dunning, and you're watching In Fact. Welcome to the show that gives you the real facts behind popular myths. If you grew up anywhere in the Western world, you undoubtedly heard that Jewish slaves built the Egyptian pyramids until Moses led them away in the Exodus. Comparing this popular tradition to history, though, shows that we have a giant disconnect. Popular beliefs, religious tradition, and archaeological evidence tell us three very different stories. Now, while it's a common belief that Jews built the pyramids, religious tradition, basically the first few books of the Bible, doesn't include the pyramids at all. It only says the Jewish slaves built cities. But archaeological evidence can't even support that much. There isn't even any accepted evidence that there were ever large populations of Jewish slaves in ancient Egypt at all.
Under a
Ever.
wicked oppressor for 400 years. You read that in the Bible. You didn't know that you were fulfilling that? "450 years we've been here, and we have caught hell every day of the 450 years.
Anger and sadness that has been ingrained in our black community, not just because of 5 minutes of horror, but 400 years.
Called the Red Summer of 1919, named for the blood that ran through America's cities during months of racial unrest. African American soldiers had returned home from the Great War, World War I, to a country still teeming with discrimination. And in their quest for civil rights, tensions between blacks and whites reached a tipping point. Deadly race riots broke out in over 24 cities, but one rural town, Elaine, Arkansas, would become the epicenter for the bloodshed. The violence there, lynch mobs, torture, indiscriminate murder, was so horrific it would go down in history not as a race riot, but as the Elaine Massacre. This is history. Dark history. During World War I, more than 350,000 African American soldiers enlisted to serve. But while they fought for democracy abroad, their own country, America, was still not willing to see them as equal.
White supremacy was very mainstream at this time in the United States. Basically, a lot of African Americans were seeking to obtain their full rights and equality in the United States, and violence was often used by mobs of whites.
Tensions reached a boiling point in the summer of 1919. Race riots broke out in dozens of cities across the country. But in the rural South, something even more menacing was taking form. There, slavery existed in all but name. In a system called sharecropping, farmers provided landowners with labor for a share of crops produced. But the system was rigged. Sharecroppers were often kept in perpetual debt.
One black sharecropper raised $500 worth of cotton, and his landlord told him, "Yeah, but you used $697 worth of supplies, so you owe me money."
Everyone who has any power at this point is working to make sure they keep African American laborers tied to the land.
For roughly 50 years, the system went unchecked. In the fall of 1918, a black man from Arkansas had had enough. Robert Hill had decided to form a union to represent sharecroppers. It was a dangerous decision, and one that would set off a chain of events involving mass murder, torture, and a landmark Supreme Court ruling. But first, he would need to organize.
In his message, Hill was pretty simple and direct. Why is it that we cannot have fair payment for the honest and hard work we do?
Despite the inherent risk involved with challenging whites, World War I veterans and other black sharecroppers became card-carrying members of the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America.
He believed that by paying dues, these members could have the services of lawyers and sue plantation owners for cotton that had been stolen from them and false numbers that had been placed in the plantation stores' books.
On the night of September 30th, 1919, union members gathered in Elaine to discuss their legal plan.
This is in Phillips County. It's basically just a crossroads at this time, a road, a few houses, a railroad siding, no streetlights. There's also a one-room wooden church, and that's where the union met. Expecting that they might have trouble, the union posted a guard of about 6 men. They had shotguns and rifles. The meeting's taking place, and while they're having this discussion, a car rolls up the road.
2 white men were in the car.
By one account, one of the white men in the car said, "You all get away from there." And shortly thereafter, a shot was fired.
Though it remains unclear who fired first, a barrage of gunfire broke out. One of the white men was killed almost instantly. The rumor of a black uprising spread in a matter of hours. The idea of a sharecropper rebellion conveniently played into the hands of landowners who did not want their sharecropping practices scrutinized. They did all they could, as quickly as they could, to sound alarms that black farmers were out for white blood.
The story gets magnified that the town is under attack, that blacks are killing people in the streets, that there is a revolution afoot.
The sharecroppers quickly formed self-defense groups, expecting repercussions over the death of a white man. But they could not have predicted just how severe the response would be. The following morning, under the watchful eye of Sheriff Frank Kitchens and his deputies, posses of white men were sent to find, detain, and kill the offenders.
When you have an out-of-control mob just being told there's a Negro insurrection going on, that mob's being very indiscriminate in its violence. You see houses being attacked, black-owned homes being ransacked.
The black school was burnt. Notable families were killed.
Black women and children have to go literally hide out in the woods because many of these people are indiscriminately shooting at African American women and their children.
Black veterans and other African Americans took up arms in self-defense.
This no doubt just feeds into the mob fervor. The fact that, oh, they're daring to shoot back at us. This must really be an insurrection.
One historian has identified more than 20 different killing sites where African Americans were being killed.
There are stories that mob members were taking souvenirs, such as ears or fingers from the bodies of fallen African Americans.
One of the leading black families of the county, they weren't even in the town. They had just received a brother back from the French front. They are pulled from a train, put in the back of a car, and they are stabbed, shot, and their mutilated bodies are left on the side of the road.
Within 2 days, 500 U.S. troops were sent to quell the supposed black uprising.
They don't find any blacks killing or shooting down the streets. In fact, Colonel Jinks reports that the city is filled with hundreds and hundreds of white men with guns. Many of the individuals who were hiding in the thickets were former soldiers who had just gotten back from the war. And when they see the army troops come, they rush out, believing that the army troops are there to assist them. The army believes that these people are rushing toward them to attack, and they're cut down by machine gun fire.
Although the exact number will never be known, a recent estimate suggests 237 black men, women, and children were killed. There was an immediate demand for justice, but not for the black lives lost. 5 white men were also killed in the fighting. Hundreds of African Americans were rounded up and put in jail, and when the jail was full, they detained the rest in a schoolhouse.
While they are detained, there is torture going on.
The goal? To elicit false confessions of a black uprising.
They whipped the men, whipped them for long periods of time. They stuffed formaldehyde up their noses, and they stripped them naked and shocked them with electrical charges. They did this until they confessed to the conspiracy.
Robert Hill escaped to Kansas, but his peers back in Arkansas were not as lucky. 122 indictments were issued, and trials quickly started.
The men were brought into the court in chains. They weren't allowed to consult with their defense attorney. The defense attorney rarely interjected, and then the all-white juries started delivering guilty verdicts. In one case, the guilty verdicts came back in 2 minutes.
It's also important to point out that there were mobs of people outside who were demanding black blood. Governor Brough maintained that at some point these people would be killed, but they would have to have been killed justly.
The governor lived up to his word. When among the 87 black citizens charged with crimes, 12 were sentenced to death by electric chair. Despite the system being blatantly rigged against them, the convicted men had one unlikely beacon of hope: the American justice system. The trials of the Elaine 12 had been highly publicized. The NAACP took notice and stepped in with legal help for the 12. For 4 years, the team faced a series of legal setbacks and advances until in 1923, the case made its way to the Supreme Court in what is now known as Moore versus Dempsey. There, the defense argued that the original trials had been mob-dominated and the black prisoners had been denied their constitutional rights. In a landmark decision, the court agreed.
The good that comes out of this is that the NAACP sees for the first time that it can win in the Supreme Court, that things don't always fall along the color lines.
The 12, subjected to torture, injustice, and litigation travesty, were at long last exonerated and released in January 1925. They might have escaped with their lives, but there was nothing that could reverse the pain and devastation felt by the black community in Phillips County, and no way to unsee the ungodly truth that American men, alongside the American government, were complicit in a massacre of American citizens on American soil.
We as a nation have grown and we continue to grow. We don't need to pretend as if we've always had everything figured out, but if we are to do justice to who we are as Americans, we've got to own all of it.
Yes, but today we have a black president. He cannot save America. He would like to. He has a good heart. But unfortunately, he has come at the time of the fulfillment of the judgment that is spoken of in both these books. You have read in both Bible and Quran that we should be looking for a man like Moses. It's here. It's here. Moses is referred to more in the Quran than any other prophet. Why? It is because the people of Moses were subjected to harsh treatment and torment by a wicked ruler. And the man, like Moses, would come from a people who were also tortured, destroyed, turned inside out by a wicked ruler whose people were wicked also. In the Bible, Pharaoh said, "Me and my people are wicked." So here we are, in the greatest nation of the last 6,000 years. Here we are. Here we are, in the worst condition. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad, for 40 years, talked to us about separation. He knew that no matter how much we tried, we would never be able to get along in peace with our former slave masters and their children. You know, God is so caring for the way you think that He brings us along and He delays His own judgment until the people of His choice understand His judgment. Do you remember the story of God visiting Abraham in the book of Genesis? And He tells Abraham that He is going to destroy the people of Sodom and Gomorrah except Lot and his family. Do you remember the words of Abraham? He said to God, "Would you destroy the righteous along with the wicked?" Well, that meant that he was not completely in agreement with God's decision against Sodom and Gomorrah. So the God didn't want to chastise Abraham, his friend, for not believing in the far-seeing knowledge of God that when He pronounces a judgment, that is it. But God wanted Abraham to agree with Him. So He said, "Well, Abraham, you go and see if you can find 50 righteous, and I'll save the city." Well, Abraham went out looking, because he believed evidently that God's judgment was not correct. He believed that there was righteous people other than Lot and his family. Now, you may ask, well, how could a friend of God think like that? Well, we do. We sometimes don't agree with the judgment of God. And it's because we don't have a comprehensive knowledge of things. So when God, who is omniscient, makes a determination, then sometimes we say, well, wait a minute, God, you know, that seems rather harsh. And He takes all of that into consideration with someone that He loves. And so He said, well, Abe, you go, see if you can find 50. I'll save the city. Abraham came back. He said, gee, I couldn't find 50. He said, well, go back. See if you can find 40. Abraham came back, he couldn't find 40. He said, well, going back, maybe there's 30, go see. And he kept that man going until he came back, he couldn't find 10. Then God said, well, if you can find one, I'll save the city. And it says, when Abraham came back and said he could not find one, said on that very day, fire and brimstone fell on Sodom and Gomorrah, as it was in the days of Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah, so shall it be at the coming of the Son of Man.